Was there no volume? I
Ah,
don't think there's volume.
No, no volume.
La técnica de extracción y su posterior corrimiento en un gel de agarosa confirmó la existencia tanto de ADN degradado como
All
moléculas
right.
pequeñas de ADN no degradadas, con la posibilidad de poder realizar un proceso fueron los siguientes. Del espécimen identificado
All
como
right.
triple
1,000 years old.
02,
Okay.
que es básicamente una muestra de tejido muscular, de la muestra identificada como triple 04, que es de tejido muscular de la cadera,
Uh,
se
I don't
lograron
know how to get
obtener
rid of these ads.
501
That's all right.
millones.
I'm pretty sure I've seen this though. Like I saw this as a kid when we'd go to my dad's house from New Mexico. We'd drive out to Tucson and you'd see the signs for the thing, right? And basically they had something, right? That was supposed to be like a body, and you saw signs for about 200 miles, and then every like 50 miles is like 150 more miles to the thing. And
Was it like south of the border style?
no, it wasn't quite south of the border, so it was just on what's that, 10, I guess. So I-10, and you're just headed west, and it's like, oh, only 54 miles
And then
left
you're
until
gonna-
the thing, right? And so we actually had my dad stop one year, and we stopped and went through the whole roadside attraction, and we're like, okay, that's what it is. But it was basically just, you couldn't tell what it was. Looked kind of like a potato or something. It was
and it was a thing.
yeah, it was just the thing, right? Like, oh, it was supposed to be an alien.
What was
right?
the
Or
what was the
maybe-
story? Was it the one captured at Roswell?
No, they didn't have any story to it. They just basically, so this was back in the 90s, and so you just have the big billboards, right? And because there was nothing else on the road, like between Deming and basically Lordsburg and Tucson and stuff, and you just eventually, like, I don't remember if it's in New Mexico or just over the border in Arizona, but you just roll out and come across this thing, and like we saw it for 2 or 3 years, and then we're like, hey, let's stop and see what the thing is. And then
That was it?
yeah, you just stop, and it's basically like the world's largest ball of twine sort of deal, right? It's just a
Oh,
little
yeah.
shopette,
Yeah.
buy some crap, and then
That you'll never. Well, those are cool, especially when you're going through your boxes and stuff like that, and you find it. You're like, you know?
Yeah, no, I don't remember having a souvenir for it, but we definitely went in there and checked it out. And that reminds me of that. It's like, oh, check out this. It's really, some guy testified that it's 100% real.
Authentic.
Right?
Yeah, that's my biggest qualm with that whole thing is it looks paper mache.
Yeah.
It looks like a middle school project I did when you're trying to make like a human and it just doesn't come out right.
Well, but I mean, South America had a lot of mummification too for what they did for older corpses. So it could be something that was 1,000 years old. But I think I think I've seen something with that where it was like, oh, and there's the DNA doesn't match up to anything human. Yeah. It's like, okay, cool
story, bro. Well, did you see it has the eggs?
No,
the
I didn't.
So they did the X-ray and it's like, this one has 3 eggs.
Right.
And it's like, okay.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, if only there wasn't like cultures around the world, like Egypt or whatever, that replaced organs with other things that would show up, right? So,
exactly. Yeah.
Whatever.
Or like put animal parts inside of them.
Yeah. Well, it's no different than, watching any of the shows and they talk about, oh, the pyramids, aliens must have done it because pyramids showed up in all these different places around the world. It's like, or humans figured out that a pyramid is a really good way to stack rocks as high as you want, right?
What do you think about the building of the pyramids though? Because the whole concept is that we don't have machinery today to move one of those large pieces of stone.
Yeah, but you don't need to, right? They've shown that you can do it with just engineering equipment with logs and everything else. If you have logs and people, and you have 50 years, you can do an awful lot, right? If
you think so?
That's your job. You have a whole workforce for 50 years. Like your dad and your grandpa's grandpa all worked on it, and the dude gets buried, and then you finish the pyramid over the top of the person who was buried, most likely.
So you think that the pyramid itself is just a tomb?
Yeah.
There's all these intricate channels though,
right? But most of them are and I don't know all of it, but I think most of them are just like, okay, so I can get the starlight from these 3 stars down into the chamber, sort of deal.
When do you think they were constructed?
I don't know. I think it was about 5,000 years ago for most of them. I mean, between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, I thought.
Have you heard of Andy Graham's theory of the Younger Dryas impact theory?
No.
So the thought process is that there was an advanced, we'll say advanced, probably not like technology,
Sure.
Wi-Fi, electricity and stuff like this, but an advanced civilization during the last ice age, right? So all the ocean water froze in the northern hemisphere, and all that did is push people further out, right?
Okay.
So the Bahamas and everything else like that in Florida, that would have been all grasslands, hills,
Sure.
and stuff like that, right? So civilizations build themselves around oceans because of the resources and everything else.
Yeah.
So the thought in at this time, this would have been 14,000 years ago, when the younger dryas impact theory happened. The civilization is probably older than that, right?
Yeah.
But the thought process is you have the civilization that's by the ocean. This meteor comes, smacks the ice caps, and causes this giant flood. So across all civilizations, all religions, we always talk about this great flood.
Mm-hmm.
And this great flood wiped out a majority of this advanced civilization. In that advanced civilization were made the Sphinx, made the pyramids, and some of the evidence to go with it geologically is like the Sphinx have water erosion,
Mm-hmm.
and they're at one point Egypt was a rainforest,
Yeah.
but that was like 20,000 years ago. So there's a lot of evidence that point to it. The interesting thought of it is that, you have this massive catastrophic flood that just wipes out everything. It'd probably be similar to like a solar flare today, would probably wipe out a majority of our stuff. Thankfully, we prepare for that stuff, and we have some servers and everything else like that that
Yeah.
are shielded, that can kind of reboot and re-civilize. But I thought it was an interesting thought process.
Yeah. I mean, but a lot of those, just going back and just thinking about different History Channel things that you've watched. It's like another one is some areas near like the Black Sea, right, where they
Mhm.
found civilizations that were completely flooded out, right?
Yeah.
And again, if you're just looking at a lot of Old Testament is really a lot of storytelling, right?
Mhm.
It's supposed to convey a story or whatever, but you can take like a nugget of truth, right? Like there is a
Sure.
civilization that got flooded out, right?
Yeah.
But to that civilization, that's their entire world, right? Like
Yeah.
if something breaks and the Black Sea floods 30 feet and your entire town and the 3 towns that you know about in your
Right.
entire world go underwater, then the world has flooded.
So I think the thought process is that a majority of the civilization were by the ocean. So in this younger dryas impact theory,
Right.
the oceans rose
rapidly.
500 meters and pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So you have people that flee, right?
Yeah.
And at the same point, you still have a majority of the earth is still uncivilized, right? So you still have hunter-gatherer groups that are
Yeah.
wandering around and whatnot. So it's not like the humanity is wiped out like Noah's Ark, but a good chunk of like 80%, right? So a good chunk of it is wiped out. And then you have like these the Anunnaki is interesting with Zoroastrianism.
No.
So it's in the Mesopotamian valley, where the religion is that these star people come down and teach all this agriculture and all this crazy stuff.
Right.
But there's also accounts in like Native American lore where it's like the fair skinned people came across the ocean on serpents and taught us X, Y, and Z. Right. And that's why Christopher Columbus coming back, they were like, we know about you.
Yeah.
What goods are you bringing? And then we just brought the plague.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But it's an interesting concept too. And then, but I do want to introduce you, Kevin.
All right. Yeah.
Kevin.
Yes.
Thank
Kevin.
you for joining me today.
Yeah.
I guess explain kind of what you do.
So I've been working. So I got a degree in mathematics and a master's in computer science, and I've been working basically software programs and now program managing software teams for the most part for the last almost 20 years. And so worked DoD my entire career, and it's been interesting. It's definitely different from a lot of what my peers in school ended up doing. So
Are they teachers?
No, most of the people that I went to school with, they ended up mostly in IT or,
Okay.
working IBM and VMware and going commercial. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that I was one of the few that started DoD, and that it wasn't a plan, right? It's who's going to offer the most money coming out of school. And
Yeah.
like the funny story that we always tell is that Christine and I were sitting there and going, where do we want to live? Well, anywhere but Texas, right? So I've got all my applications out and everything else, and I get a job offer out with the NSA, and they're like, "Oh, you should come out to DC," and they're like, "We'll pay you $35 grand a year," and I was like. They were super stoked too.
What
Because
year was this?
This was 2005, and they're like, "Oh, I'm so excited because you have a master's degree, so we can bump you up to 35." And I was just like, I can't do it, man. Like,
dude, that is pennies on the dollar.
So, but I did have a friend who ended up going and working out in DC, and they start you really low.
Yeah.
And then if you're competent, then you actually raise up pretty quickly. But basically they try to starve you out that first few years. Right.
Yeah.
So, but, so we
try to see if you're enticed by like foreign nationals, like you want an extra $50,000. You're like, dude, I'm on food stamps right now. Yes. Yes. I want that $50,000.
Maybe so. I don't know what the reason is, because he's made a good living staying out in the DC area, but man, yeah, I thought for sure he was going to starve that first year.
Where'd you go to school?
New Mexico State. So,
okay.
Down in Las Cruces. So we're sitting in Las Cruces, the common thing in southern New Mexico. My parents and Christine's parents are both in southern New Mexico. And it was all, everybody always ragged on the Texans driving through the mountains and everything else. So it was like anywhere but Texas. So I got job offer for the NSA. That was a joke. I got another job offer in southern New Mexico. And then lo and behold, I get a job offer to go northeast of Dallas for about 60 grand. Right. And it's like, all right, that's
double your salary.
I'll double up.
Yeah.
So we ended up moving out there and living out there for about 9 years. So
most of what you're doing now is aerospace. Is that right?
Yep. It's aerospace, and I've been always around aircraft and, now doing some satellites and some space stuff, but really it's been a lot of aerospace engineering, and definitely never would have thought that that's where I was going to end up.
Yeah. I would assume that'd be more of like a physics route. You know what I mean?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of, you run across a lot of people that are mechanical and aeronautic engineers, and they know that that's what they want to do. They want to be a part of a space program. They want to build planes. They want to build missiles, whatever the case may be. And really, I was getting my degree in mathematics and had to take a couple of computer science classes. That's the one thing that I'll say that New Mexico State did really well in the math department. They're like, you need to be able to apply this, because otherwise it's, hey, you can do proofs better than the next guy. How are you going to get paid for that?
Mm-hmm.
So they said, hey, you need to take 2 computer science classes to get your degree. And took a computer science class, and I was good at it, right? Computer science is math that you break down into small components, and then you iterate and you just teach the computer what you want it to do over that. And I asked the professor, I was like, hey, so what do I need to do to get like a dual major computer science and mathematics? He's like, oh, don't get a bachelor's, get a master's. And I was like,
he just wants that money.
It's like, yeah. All right, man. So needless to say, it took 3 years to get a master's, because I had to take all the classes for the bachelor's anyways. Yeah. So I should have gotten a bachelor's degree in computer science as well. But just kind of ended up doing that and getting a job. And it's kind of funny because you do a bunch of stuff in school. You learn how to solve problems in school. Right? Yeah. That's what you do. And then you actually go out into the workforce, and that's when you learn how to solve problems for some reason.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Did you do any internships?
I didn't. So I didn't do any internships. Nowadays, I think that that's a really good thing to do. I've seen that that's really worked out for folks, and I would suggest people doing it, but I didn't. So I actually paid my way through school for most of it. I was a bank teller for 7 years. So I, like, Wells Fargo paid for me to go get a math degree. And then, I had a fellowship to go back and get my master's. So I, always working in kind of research. So that's kind of like, I had a GAN fellowship. Mm-hmm. So it's a little similar, right? So I ended up teaching a class, and I ended up helping with some research.
While you were in your master's program?
Yeah. But that was all just for the master's side. For the bachelor's, it was, tuition reimbursement.
Yeah.
Go work at, $5-6 an hour and then get your tuition reimbursed as long as you were working 35 hours a week.
I would do that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it
I
worked
wish
out
they,
really
so
well.
when I went through my bachelor's program, they didn't have anything set up to kind of incentivize you as a student to give back to the university. They forced you to do community service hours.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was like, you need 400 community service. It was something ridiculous.
Yeah. We didn't have any of that.
Yeah. And so I was in the reserves at the time. So like, thankfully they took my reserve duty hours and they're like, oh, we'll reduce because you're committed on weekends, we'll reduce the amount of community service hours you have to do.
Nice.
But you still have to give some community service hours. So I just ended up doing, because I went to an HBCU, I was like, oh, let me go over to the theater department. I bet they're looking for a white dude. And I kid you not, Professor Hilton at NCCU was like, I actually have this play coming up, but you're going to have to play a racist. And I was like, I'll do it, but you're writing off all of my community service hours.
We're going to do it all.
Yeah. I was like, I don't care if I come here for 30 hours of practice, you're writing off the rest of like the 200.
Right.
And he's like, all right, yeah, I'll make that deal. So
you'd make that deal?
Yeah,
I'll make that deal.
Yeah, you make that deal. That's a damn good deal.
That's a damn good deal.
So yeah, I wish I don't know if colleges still do that. I'm sure they do for like,
I think it just depends on the university. So New Mexico State, what they had really ended up with was they had the same bloat as everywhere else where I think when it came down to it, it was really hard for anybody to graduate in 4 years. Right. But
yeah, because of the added classes.
Yeah. Just, the humanities and stuff like that. Now I will, I'll say this, right. You end up taking like international economics. And I find that things that I learned in international economics or, this other humanities class, I was just talking to somebody earlier this week, we talked about Enron. But when I was in that class, it was 2001. So 2001, yep, because I graduated in 2002 with my bachelor's. So 2001, I think, we're talking about Enron and how they were going to change the world because Enron was the best thing ever, right? And like,
what is it?
So exactly? Enron. So the big thing about Enron was they were like an energy trading setup, right? Okay. But if you go back and look at it, Enron was just a gigantic scam. There's lots of shell companies and everything else. And there's some things that came out of that. But Enron was, it was touted as the next thing. This was going to save the world. This was going to change how energy was done and everything else. And then it's just a big old scheme. Lots of shell companies eventually blows up. And one of the things that ended up I'd say one of the only good things that came out of Enron kind of exploding like that was they had a lot of the people that work there got stock options and got company match and everything else. And the stock kept going up through the.
So if you checked out your stock soon enough before it tanked.
Correct. But you weren't going to know that because it all came crashing down. And on top of that, it wasn't actually, you weren't allowed to take your stock out like that. So back in the early 2000s, and when I got my first job, they had 401k matches for publicly traded companies, but you had to hold it inside that company's stocks. They could give you that as company match and they would hold that stock and you couldn't move it right away. So it stayed in the company. Oh. So that was one thing that did change. I don't remember.
Well, that probably reduced the amount of, because stocks end up going down if too many of them are traded.
Right.
So it probably showed the company had X amount of stock that was staying in the company.
And you used to be able to do that, right? Was really kind of get people to hold the stock. You could, I give you match, but you're holding it in our company. And so they actually changed that for publicly traded companies where now you can make those moves pretty quickly because basically all those folks at Enron lost their jobs and lost all of their savings too, and all of their retirement because they had, and it was, the stock was going up. So
was this during the housing crash too? Was this coincided?
I think this was before, but it was pretty close, right? So 2005, it started going 2005 to 2008. Everything was still going crazy with the housing market. So it was before the Great Recession that I think Enron collapsed. But I think it took a number of years before they changed that. But now it's kind of like an afterthought, right? You get company stock in your publicly traded company, and you can change things out pretty quickly.
That's what my buddy does. He works for NetApp, and every year, he at the end of the year, he cashes out all of his stock options and immediately puts it over into like a bond, and just something a little bit more stable, because he went to school for marketing and economics, and he's basically like, this party's gonna end pretty soon.
See, he's a hater, because
he's a hater. Yeah, he's like, well, so he's equating the AI boom to the .com boom, or the bust, right?
Sure.
So it's like all these small companies are coming out, all these people are dumping money into it. The NFTs, all the money lost in NFTs and everything else like that. He's basically looking at the writing on the wall going, I'm not 100% sure a crash is going to come, but I'm going to go ahead and put everything in like 5-year bonds just to be on the safe side.
So I was just listening to a buddy of mine, and I actually have something set up, and I need to get it to you, but we were listening to a podcast while we were working on the house up in Fairplay, and he's like, oh yeah, you should listen to this guy. And the guy basically breaks down. He's like, hey, here's what it comes down to. The stock market is up 77% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if you're betting against it, you might hit.
You got to hit that 20.
Right. You've got to hit it just right.
Yeah.
But then at some point, even if you hit it, even if your buddy hits it, right, you have to still go back into the stock market to buy low after the crash.
Well, I think, are you talking about like shorting it? Because shorting it's different than just pulling out.
I'm talking about if he's staying on the sideline, right, and he's trying to preserve capital, right. But that only pays off if then it does tank, and then you buy in so that you can get it back on the upswing.
Yeah.
So timing, it's like fantasy football. So I don't put my 401k, my 401k. I don't take a whole lot of risks with it, right? I pick a target fund, and I just say, I'm going to shove in a whole bunch of money. And my whole philosophy on that is, I'll beat it by putting more money in, right?
Yeah.
And living there long enough.
So when it goes down, that's when you buy more.
Yeah. I'm always putting in, right? Always getting the match, always trying to max out what I can put in there. Because if you're trying to time it, it's just like, I'm going to lose fantasy football again this season, right?
That's true.
Because, these guys are hot. And then I hold on to him, and I'm like, but he was so good earlier. And then you're just watching him suck more and more and more. It's like, I should sell him now. Nobody wants him now. Like, I should have sold him back when he was hot. So I'm not any good at picking any of that stuff. So it's just do it over time, do it for a long enough period of time, and I'll beat everybody else, because anybody who's picking is going to pick winners and they're going to pick losers. Yeah. And I'm just going to beat it by spreading it out over my entire career, shoving in a ton of money.
Yeah. I try not to stress too much about the market. It might cause I just matched the S&P 500 and then I just let it go, because there was, when I was deployed and I had plenty of time on my hand. I sat there and looked at trends, and I was like, all right, let me buy, on Robinhood or something like that. I'm like, let me buy this stock. And but I found myself sitting there working out at the gym at the Rock at Aliyah Salim. And then I was like, checking my phone. I was like, what is it at? It's going up 50 cents. Should I sell? It's $100, for whatever I have in there. And, I was making these short trades and stuff like that. And it was gambling, but it was just fun. Yeah. At this point in my life, I don't want that added to everything else that I have going on. It's like, it takes away from time with kids, because then you're like checking your phone, or you're getting alerts and everything else like that.
I've got a buddy who likes to do it, right? And he spends a lot of time doing it, and he's been successful with it. That's not me. Yeah. I'm never going to put the amount of time into it that it would be required. So at this day and age, with how corrupt Congress is, just find like a congressperson that's really good at setting trades and just match what they're doing. If you could get that, if you could get the information on it. So
well, they have to announce it. The question is how quick can you place your trade?
But that's the whole thing. You're going to be beat by computers, and you're going to there's somebody else who has got a computer algorithm that's probably watching that.
Well, did you? There was a scandal. I don't know if it's a scandal. I don't know if I should say this, because I think they're still doing it. But there's a time delay between Chicago and New York and the computers.
Okay.
And I'm talking like minimal seconds. But if you get a supercomputer, you can see when raw goods are going up in price or whatever, and then the correlation between, like, we'll say a company that sells lumber, right? So like, lumber raw good went up. What is that called? It's not the is it the NASDAQ?
No, I don't think so. It's the commodity market, probably, right? But
it's based in Chicago. So the difference of there's a friend's father who does this full time and makes thousands of dollars doing it,
right?
Just because there's this time delay that he can place, or the computer will place the trade,
sure,
immediately.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I'd heard about something where they had the computers trying to get them as close to Wall Street as possible, and then, like you said, it's nanoseconds, and they're trying to basically just beat everybody else.
Yeah,
because they were able to put the trades and short things faster, or basically just beat everybody else, as they could watch a trend and just beat everybody else to it because their timing was faster. So,
yeah. What do you make of so that was one side tangent for your college, right?
Yeah.
And you what else did you do in outside of mathematics and computer? Did you do anything else?
Not
or
really.
Did you really focus on those?
No. So actually, when I started, I graduated high school and I didn't know what I wanted to do. Right. There's a lot of kids. My oldest doesn't know what she wants to do. She wants to do some sort of engineering. I actually started going to CSU and going for civil engineering. And the whole point was, might as well. I mean, civil engineering, they'll always need civil engineers, right? It's not a passion, right, of mine or anything else. And really all it came down to was ended up transferring to New Mexico State. I even took 6 months off of school. I wasn't into it after my sophomore year at CSU. And then came back for civil engineering, but I took a statistics class and like, I absolutely loved it. Right. That was cool. Right. That was the coolest thing ever. And then I just went and said, hey, maybe I'll go get this degree in mathematics instead. So then I just doubled up and tripled up on classes and kind of finished it up. And then kind of, like we said, went into the computer science. But for me, it's always been solving problems. It doesn't really matter how, right? So I was never the best programmer, right? Actually, my brother, he was always really into computers. And when he found out I was going back for my master's, he's kind of fired up because he's like, oh, computers is my thing. Well, it's not that I was great at computers. I never was a big IT guy or anything else. It was, I could use them to solve problems. So I came out and I actually only wrote software for probably 6 or 7 years, right?
What did you work in?
So we did, when I got out of college, I started in C# and C++, and that was still pretty early for C#. This was, 2005, 2006. And then actually that was when I was working some research and development stuff, some base defense, like creating, sensor networks and stuff to figure out if people were opening doors or getting through fences. And then ended up going kind of back in time, right? Writing C code on Sun Solaris machines, right? Because it was a legacy program.
You have to retrofit.
Yeah, so you have to retrofit. And I think I still talk to some of the folks on those first programs, and they finally got to a Linux baseline at some point, but like it took them multiple years and lots of millions of dollars to go back and take a system that had been working for 30 or 40 years and upgrade it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have a few friends of mine that are still in the nuclear field, like security forces, and there's a lot of let me see what I can say. There's a lot of push to integrate new technologies into a lot of stuff, but then at the same time, from a strategic standpoint, there's an advantage to being very basic and analog.
Yeah.
And so there's this duality of like, how advanced do we get? If we get advanced, we need to be super advanced versus if it works, it works. So why fix it?
Right.
So I think there's because there's right now there's certain areas that are still staying analog as a backup.
Yeah.
Because ultimately,
well, but people say that, right?
Yeah.
So a good example is I actually worked and I did some work with trying to protect our energy grid as well.
Yeah.
And so I was working on binary armor, and we ended up, you go through and you're trying to help people understand things. And they're like, oh, I have an operational technology network. Nobody can get on it because I keep it off the net. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, that's your goal or your plan. Is that real? Right. Like, and so sometimes we'd go out to a facility and we'd have some tools, and basically we'd just look for network traffic.
Yeah.
And something that's supposed to be completely
like a sniffer
off. Basically off the grid and like off the net. And, it's very closed network and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
But there's printers on that network trying to reach out to phone home for whatever reason. And you're just like, guys,
bro.
Because,
and that's not even encrypted most of the time.
No. Well, and most of the operational technology networks of old, and there's still a bunch out there,
they probably
are unencrypted.
Or they're on 64-bit instead of 260, or what is it?
It doesn't matter. Either the encryption is old or but it's non-existent, because when it was being put into place, it was going analog to digital, and it was all closed. None of it was online. So there was no need for cybersecurity. So we're trying to retrofit across the US and the world, right? To go and secure these things. But there's still a lot of work to go. Right. So they're still trying to figure that stuff out.
Work with, there's a friend of mine that works for Lumen, and like Lumen Technologies for the fiber optics.
Okay. Yeah.
And his big project now is figuring out the security of a fiber optic, say from like DC to Cheyenne.
Right.
And figuring out, like, it's secured unless you get tapped into it.
Right.
So they're integrating a lot of those sensors in, like, so soil disruption.
Right.
So like if somebody puts a shovel within X amount of square mileage of this line, someone's getting alerted, and there's probably going to be a Black Hawk flying above.
Well, so there's a bunch of that, and what we found was interesting when I was working on that technology was that most of the time people were just retrofitting with detection. So something that you're talking about, right? Like intrusion detection systems. And so you're just looking for, hey, what's anomalous behavior? And then you're trying to alert somebody, and then you got to get Blackhawks, or you got to get people, or you got to get whatever. And when we were working on it, we were actually trying to do cybersecurity at the edge, right? Like we could code up, or we knew the workflow. So if you were trying to open up pipes or pumps or whatever, we knew the workflow that should be happening. So you could actually check if somebody's trying to do something out of the standard sequence. So you're basically putting some logic in there that allows you to do state-based cybersecurity, and it's very novel. But I thought that it was pretty neat, because then you're basically, you block anything that somebody else gets on that network and starts trying to open up all the valves without going into safe mode, or start whatever the case.
It's almost like time of day prevention too.
And you could set times. You could say, hey, you're not in a maintenance window. You could set a whole bunch of rules, but it was labor intensive to figure out, right? Whereas the other stuff is, you basically put network sniffers on, and when things look weird, you tell
the bells
somebody,
and whistles go off.
It sends a email, and you hope that somebody comes online and does something quickly enough that it doesn't destroy everything in the meantime. So, but just kind of cool stuff to work on. But that was,
so how long did you? So you did that for the DoD or the energy grid for a while. And then I know we talked. You said you did a contract over in Afghanistan.
So that was with my first stuff, and it was just really supporting work and supporting the program that I was on. So it's actually only one trip, but it was about 10 days, and it was interesting. It was definitely different, right? So
did you deal with a lot of military personnel outside of that?
So it's always been military. So that, again, working for DoD, it's always been dealing with a lot of military customers and getting to come do demonstrations or do projects for different groups. So it's always been kind of interesting and cool. So that is one thing that I'll say for that type of career that I hadn't really thought about, is getting to see a lot of cool stuff. So,
well, at the beginning when you said you didn't know what you wanted to do after high school, I was like, military.
Well, so
it's
actually,
like the go-to.
It's the go-to, except that, it's one of those things where the military was like, well, I want you for 4 years. And I was like, I can't possibly choose something for 4 years. Well, I've spent, it's 2005, I got into this. So
you could almost be at retirement.
Yeah, exactly. I could almost be at retirement. And that's, anybody who knows me is like, oh, that Kevin's been talking about retirement since before he started. Because at the end of the day, like, I like solving problems. Work is work. Right. And at the end of the day, I enjoy it when I enjoy work. And when you don't enjoy work, it's a chore. Right.
Yeah.
But I've never loved my job. Right. There's people out there that just love what they do. And I'm so envious of that. I got a buddy who deals in coins, and he loves looking for and grading coins and selling coins and auctioning and all that stuff. And it's like, man, that's the coolest thing ever, because I would love for a hobby of mine to actually pay for itself, right? Or to pay me to do that full time would be cool.
Well, now you're more of a project manager role. Is that right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the frustrations with dealing with, I guess, what do you guys use? Do you guys use like sprints and stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, it just depends on the different groups. So everybody likes to talk about being agile and whatever else. And really I've seen people actually be slower, because now they just take a couple of days out of every 2 weeks to plan. Right. And it's like, but you're late every time. Yeah. So your planning is not working. So either your metrics are off or whatever. And I've done that for years, is, try to do 1 week sprints and those types of things, or even 2 week sprints. But it's just different ways of doing work. But I do find that a lot of people put a lot of stock in, well, I'm doing this, so this is my metrics and this is why it's great. It's like, so how did you end up at 2x the cost and 2x the time if your sprints are so awesome?
Yeah.
Right. Realistically, if this is really saving everything, why is it that you're always late and that you're always over budget? So I think that it really comes down to, again, it comes down to the people working it more than the processes always. And that's always the case.
Yeah. And then, so like at the end of a project, what determines whether or not it gets pulled? If you spend so much time and energy and all this other stuff, like, who has the ultimate say to come in and be like,
well, I've worked a lot of research and development, and I'll tell you, there's just times where it just doesn't matter how well you perform. Sometimes it's politics of research and development. It's somebody wants to take limited resources and put it towards something else, right? Like there's times where you're like, hey, this is going to feed the next batch of programs, and somebody's going to have to solve why the software is not working. Right, why we can't fly in this manner. We can solve it here in the cheapest. It's just like everything else. So every project is the earlier you solve something, the cheaper it is, right? If you wait until the end, it always gets more and more expensive the more time goes by. So whenever they cancel a research and development project, when you've got some bugs or some problems that you're trying to work out and they're hard, but you know that it's immediately going to feed into another project, it's a bad trade.
But at the end of the day, they're not just totally canning what you worked on. They're just taking the information from that one and they roll it.
Sometimes they roll it. That's the funny thing, is I think the metric is somewhere around 10% of what is being done for research and development kind of moves on. Right. So you have 90% stinkers, right? Yeah. And 10% kind of grows. So,
yeah. And I guess when you're working in that field, you're talking about propelling humanity into some new era, right? So either more satellites, either the American DoD infrastructure as far as bolstering our defense and stuff like that. The 90% waste.
Yeah.
So long as that 10% is better than, say, China, Russia.
Right.
I think that's really the only. I mean, I guess the EU, but
well, no, I mean, everybody's got research and development, right? So at the end of the day, you have to be doing research and development if you're going to keep propelling things forward. And the real hope is that the people that are in charge of deciding what's good and what's not, they're making good decisions, sound decisions. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. Like there's a lot of times where I've spent my career just going, man, I don't know how this person got in charge of allocating $50 million in research and development. Right. Why is this guy in charge? Oh, because he's friends with the CEO. Right. So he's been in this position, and it's not because he's really good at picking winners. He picks a lot of dumb ideas, right?
Yeah.
That all cancel within 2 or 3 years. I've never seen something kind of hit that next stage, but
it's rubbing elbows with the right people.
Yeah. It's politics. And that seems to be what it is a lot. Like, I'll go back to, talking about, working through operational technology security and doing some of that work. Is a really good mousetrap, right? But if you don't have a person that can get you in front of the right people,
yeah,
it just doesn't matter. You can have the best mousetrap, but it doesn't matter because somebody else had more hooks or whatever and is just going to do, detection versus prevention.
Yeah.
And you find that type of stuff, and it's just really disheartening sometimes to know that you've got something that could really make a difference and to really change some things. And it just doesn't matter because you have to get the politics right. Yeah. And that's the hard part.
Is that what causes some of the, I would say, burnout in your career? Is that constant going from one project, either not working, getting canned, and then going on to the next one?
That I like I said, I've worked a lot of research and development, and recently I've had more get canceled than not, right? But there's a lot of times where that actually drives me, going from one project to another. I've almost always, as a program manager, so starting in about, when was that? 2014 was when I started as a program manager. And I used to always just have, diverse portfolios, right? It was never just one project at a time. It's lots of different projects and seeing those through. So sometimes those are successful and sometimes they're less successful, right? But it's always the thing that I did like about work was, having customers be excited and having a good interaction with the customers when you're finishing something up.
Mm-hmm.
So that really helps. I think sometimes with the research and development, since it's internal, right? If you're not showing it off to a customer, then you're showing it off to somebody who, like we said, if the politics aren't there, they just don't care, right? Like, we showed, I remember one time, I was super stoked because we actually were working on the same cybersecurity stuff, and we had 9 demonstrations at the end of the year. This is what your money got you for the end of the year. This was all the things we were going to protect. Some avionics. So we were going to protect some different grid. We had a simulation system that you could take out to different people to show basically a little city that we had set up, and just bam, bam, bam. We had all these 9 projects. And the feedback that we got afterwards was, we're spread too thin. Like, we're not focused on one or two things. It was like, but
all these 9 things are banger.
Right. And it was free, right? Like, it just works in all of these places. But the feedback was, no, you're not hyper focused enough in one or two spots. And I was like, never mind. Like, you're not getting what we're saying, that this is applicable towards lots of
multiple things. Yeah.
So,
wow.
So, that can lead to some burnout, but, and it just depends on what programs you're working on. There's a lot of them. I've spent, most of my average programs are, when I was working in, kind of fast and furious with some IREDs and stuff, 6 months to 2 years. That's what I've spent most of my career on. But, what actually got me to change jobs a couple of times was, the Great Recession hit. They moved me from some IRAD to like a long established program. And by long established, I mean 30 or 40 years sort of deal. And I ended up working on a team. It was a great team, but I was like the 7th person on that team, and I had 5 years of experience, and I was 7th on the depth chart. Right. So with 5 years of experience, I was the new guy, and I was probably going to stay the new guy. Right. Because that program moves so slowly that people were going to have their entire career working on that single platform.
Right.
And I just told him, I said, I can't, after a couple of years, I'm like, I can't do this anymore. This is the stasis chamber. I can't sit here, spend 25 years and then pop out the other side and just retire and say, this is what I did. Like I couldn't do it. So I actually prefer having, I like having some, I like consistency, right? So if I know that we're doing a good job, right, know that it's going to continue, know what the next steps are, cross sell it, keep making modifications, make things better and better, and have small enough chunks that you can feel like you're getting things accomplished. But I know that on a lot of programs with like deep space or whatever, so you're going to spend 5 or 10 years getting your vehicle ready, then you're going to launch it, and it's going to take 2 or 3 years before it gets to where it needs to go, and then you're going to find out if you screwed up.
Well, right? What's interesting about that too is like with everything coming out in the news, if you think back 10 years ago of what we knew about the periodic table, right, just from a material science, we are now, Neil deGrasse Tyson was just talking about this and how there's like a reverse periodic table that we don't see. It's like everything empty that quantum physics has proven exists, but we just don't know how to
manipulate it.
How do we manipulate it? How do we make stuff out of it and all this other stuff? So it's like 10 years ago, that was just, you were batshit crazy if you talked about it. Right. And I'm sure there's secret scroll people, working out at S4 or like Holman Air Force Base and stuff like that have access to some of like the UAPs that, Grush is talking about, that this stuff. So like Bob Lazar is another person that talks about element 115. And it's like, if you look at the periodic table, it's like, okay, well, it doesn't go that far.
Right.
And he was talking about this back in like the 80s, 90s and stuff like that. And then come 2014, I think is the particle collider.
Yeah. CERN particle colliders.
CERN.
Yeah.
So they launched that up and they detected element 115 in a radioactive state. And they're like, well, I guess it is real.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that there can be such long projects, right?
Mm-hmm.
With almost, and I get it, you have to start somewhere, but and almost in a layman's view, it's like, why are we rushing to get this stuff done in 10 years when in 10 years we might have a vehicle that goes faster than the one that you already launched?
Yeah. I would say the counter to that is might have something in 10 years, right? So if you always do that, then it's like, well, why are we spending any time trying to go back to the moon, right? Or go to Mars? Because why don't we wait until we get the vehicle that can just, why not just work on teleporters?
Well, it's a Saturn rocket, right? That got us to the Apollo missions and stuff. Why is it that we're having such a hard time? So I'll trigger you a little bit. Do you think the world is flat?
No.
You don't think there's a firmament?
No.
I say that jokingly. I don't actually think the world is flat.
No, I mean, and it's the thing that's crazy is like just looking at it objectively from the outside. It's like, so the world is flat, but everything that we can observe with telescopes is not, right? Like, that's a very interesting. So everything else that we can see, right, in the solar system and beyond, we can tell is not flat.
Yeah.
And then you have scientists saying it's not flat, right? And it was proven to be not flat with some experiments a long time ago. And you're like, I get it. Like, if you're, so does that mean that you never do any medicine, or you never believe anything that you can't see? Right. So like if you have to always observe something yourself before you believe it, you have a very, very narrow view of what life is actually all about, right? Like cancer doesn't exist because you've never had it, right? Like, I mean, what Earth is flat. Cancer doesn't exist because you've never had it, right? And technically, you've never seen death. So if you've never seen death, then death doesn't occur, right? Like, that one's rough for me.
Hold on, I've got to take a quick break because I got to pee really bad. But we'll pick this up, and we're back. I've been drinking a gallon of water a day.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. So I literally have to like pee almost every hour. I feel like a pregnant woman. So observable versus reality, right?
Right.
So a lot of the flat earthers will say, I'll be honest with you, the government hasn't done itself any favors. I do think the moon landing happened.
Yeah.
I think the filming of it happened in a studio.
I don't think so. Because
You don't think so?
No, because I watched. It was something that was kind of like a busting of myths. Where it's like, oh, you can't see the shadow or this or that. And
Well,
the
that
other.
makes sense on the lunarscape.
Right.
I'm just saying that the film quality,
Hmm.
the original film quality, is almost too good. And how did they live stream like the Apollo mission itself? Back when we didn't have, well, I won't say, so we probably had it.
Yeah.
Right. But it's still like, why would we divulge that type of secret, like communication style, where it's like, oh, we can live stream video?
Well, because it was 100% about smashing the USSR.
Yeah.
Right.
Fuck Russia.
Right. So it was 100% about just, it was stomping on their dick. Right. Like just and straight going for it. So it was worth every penny to basically, and it's just a signal, right? It's just a TV signal or a radio signal.
Yeah.
It's just
we take for granted today.
Yeah, we take it for granted, and
yeah,
it was tough, right? I'm sure it was hard, but at the same time, right? It did an awful lot of stuff. Having Skylab up there, and that's the part as being a software person, where I just look at all the bloat and, I want to play a game. Well, I got to download 130 gigs to play a game on my computer.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, even when we had our first computer and I'd ask my stepdad if I could put a new game on it. He's like, how many kilobytes is it? It's like, oh, it's 32. He's like, well, we got to delete another game before you can play that one. Right. And when you think about that was in the 80s. Right.
Yeah.
And so you've got Skylab and everything else that's running on, just a number of bits. Right. And everything had very specific things that they were doing. Just crazy. Right.
So why is it that, because it is said a lot. Why is it that people say that the Saturn rocket we cannot recreate?
We could, just the cost of things, right? So if you put everything, and again, so here's another good example. So Sunspot in southern New Mexico, right? It's basically a ghost town now. It's for researchers. New Mexico State University has it, but that's where my grandfather worked for his entire career. That's my dad started up there. I'd go up there and we'd live up there and everything else. And in the 60s and 70s, when they were trying to figure out solar flares and what it would do to their new satellites and their new whatever, there was a lot of Army money being put into science. And that place was always hopping, right? There was people, they had an airfield up there for the Army guys to come and fly their helicopters up to 9,800 feet and then come up and see what was going on with science. And once they figured out what they needed, all of the military money dried up. So if you're beating the USSR, right, what do you have? You have access to military money. Right.
Yeah.
And that's what you have access to. You have the force of a nation behind you to do these big bet type of projects. And now you look at when we decided to go back to the moon, right? George Bush was like, oh, we're going to go back to the moon. And he declared it. Right. And everybody's like, what? He's like, yep, I've decided we're going to go back to the moon. And then he didn't fund NASA to the right level. So it ended up the Artemis program and everything else lingered.
Yeah. Right.
And became a job work program for a lot of time. And it's been successful now. They have gone around they have their first flight. There'll be a couple more flights and then they'll be ready to put people back on the moon, but they're still not being funded to meet the deadlines that everybody wants. So 2026, not going to happen. Why? Because it's not being funded. Like, hey, I need $10 billion. Cool. What can you do for 2? Not a whole lot. right? And
Yeah.
now I'm going to lose people. I'm going to lose the right scientists and
Yeah.
everything else. So when it comes down to it, it'll cost them, maybe 15 or $20 billion to go back to the moon. And it will take an extra decade, right, from where they thought. But they'll get there eventually, right? So when we look at, hey, can we build another Saturn rocket? We could, right? We definitely could. You could go back to those blueprints and you could build them, but you might not have the place that built it, right? That manufacturing facility, it might be defunct for 30 years,
Right.
right?
So you need a new metal workshop.
Right. You need you
Yeah.
need to re-stand up. Like it was a national goal to
Yeah.
do all of those things, right? They came up, and if you ever watched, I don't remember the name of the movie, but they basically had to come up with new math to do space flight, right?
Mm.
It didn't exist, right? So when they were trying to do the first Mercury missions and everything else, they kept having stuff like burn up because they couldn't do the math to do both getting into space and then doing reentry. And like,
Yeah.
so this was before computers and before everything else. And they're having to figure out how to make this stuff work. And it was not easy, and the USSR was ahead, right? So, but it was a whole nation kind of geared up, almost, I would say, not quite a wartime footing, but that type of mentality, right?
Well, yeah, they were coming fresh out of World War II,
Right.
so they still had that, they being the generation itself,
Yeah.
The 20-year-olds that fought in World War II that had this tenacity to get the nation together. They were 45, 50 at this time.
Yeah.
So they were the ones that were in charge of these programs. So they knew the importance of that. And I do feel like we've tapered off in our desire for the stars a little bit.
Mm.
I think with the UAP, the UFO hearings and everything else like that, people are they are re-energized about the prospect of exploration of the stars, or at least our solar system, right?
Yeah.
Like it would be super dope if at some point we could, with standard propulsion, get the Mars trip down to 6 months.
Yeah.
Granted, you would have to launch because of how the planets move and stuff like that. You'd have to launch when they are at their closest, but it'd be really cool if at some point with the standard propulsion method, we could get there in 6 months. I do think there was I think it's a Harvard scientist. I follow Neil deGrasse Tyson on Instagram. And he was just talking about this new gravity drive system that I think, well, I'll get into what I think, but I guess the concept is the energy yield is so great that it distorts the gravity in front of the ship and basically pulls it through space-time.
Right.
So you don't have to deal with thrust out the back, Isaac Newton's,
Right.
mathematics. We can deal with more of like probably getting to Einstein's relativity, but even he didn't really address time too much until later.
No, yeah. And so I was actually just listening to something today in the car, coming back from my hunting trip, and they were actually talking about how, you can show that time slows down the faster you go, right?
Yeah.
So there's reasons that you can never reach, the speed of light, and just time starts to slow down for the observer in the vehicle as it gets faster and faster.
Yeah.
So there's things that just are I don't know that that's the things that are really the biggest problem, right? Like realistically, if it takes 6 months or it takes 18 months, what's the difference? Truthfully, it's not
Well,
that.
it's time. If you're sitting on a ship,
Sure.
that's boring.
Of course it's boring, but I mean, all of the people that you're going to send have a lot of things that they can and should be doing, especially on the way back, right? You've got preparation on the way there.
Yeah.
And then if you're doing it right, like if you're going to Mars and you're doing it right, you've already dumped a whole bunch of unmanned stuff so that you can basically print structure and print
hopefully
whatever.
The robots that we send over there do it.
Right.
Because that would be great.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole point, right? So you've got things that you're doing, and it's a singular mission, and it's okay. I think, the things that I think that worry people more is, the radiation in space. We all take radiation for granted. I'll go
Mhm.
outside and I'll get a sunburn. I just need my sunscreen, right? And not until I started working with some of the stuff in space do you just start thinking or talking about total dose and everything else,
Mhm.
and computers having to be shielded and everything. But the human body, even on the ISS, they're getting hit with a lot of radiation. And they had the two twins. I don't remember. I think it's Mark Kelly and
Yeah.
his brother.
Yep. One's a little bit younger than the other.
Right. And moreover, they also just showed that it actually changed some of their physical makeup by being in space a little bit longer.
From the
right?
radiation?
From the radiation.
Oh, okay.
Right. So from the radiation and the different effects on low gravity or zero gravity on the
Yeah.
body. So you go and you fly 6 months or 18 months. Both of them require so much shielding to actually protect a human that you're basically just getting nuked with radiation the entire time that you're going and the entire time that you're coming back, because there's not. And then
Yeah.
when you're on Mars, there is no gravitational field to stop the radiation there
Yeah.
either. So
Yep.
like, realistically, Elon Musk has it right. And he's a funny guy, right? Because he's like, oh, lol. Yeah, I'm going to send people to Mars and they're probably going to die. And people are like, oh, I'm so stoked to go to Mars and
Yeah.
die for Elon Musk.
They just did the SNL skit
Right.
with Pete, whatever his last name is, Pete something.
Davidson or something.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. And he's like, you will die. He's like, cool.
Yeah, no, I
You
mean,
know?
it's
Yeah.
the same. It's the same crap all the
Yeah.
time. It was no different than COVID vaccinations. It was Bill Gates. He was going to put a chip in you, right? And it's like, oh, we can't get a shot because we'll get a chip. And then Elon Musk is like, I want to put a chip in your head, and everybody's like, sign me up, let's go, bro.
Yeah.
Like, what?
Yeah.
So
when it comes from the Lord our Savior Elon Musk, it's okay,
right? But
I'll do anything.
Everything else is jacked.
Yeah.
I just I do hope that we do some more exploration and everything else, but I do think that it's going to take new drives and new whatever.
Yeah.
But realistically, I would like to know what people are going to do to try to shield, because otherwise,
well, I wonder how radiation would react to like distorting gravity, right? Because I think we use the term gravity to define it was explained I was watching a TED talk, but it's like a fish will go its entire life swimming around and not knowing it's actually in water unless it bites a hook,
right,
and gets yanked out, or it jumps out of water for a brief second
Sure.
and comes down, right? Gravity is kind of like our water. It's the thing that we're all in, and we're just now in the last 100 years, 150 years, just now realizing like, oh, this thing is everywhere.
Yeah.
And it increases because of mass,
Mhm.
but it modifies because of energy and
Yeah.
does all this weird stuff. Oh, let's see how we can influence it. And I feel like we're finally hitting the point, and I'm not sure, going back to like the UAP stuff, I'm not sure if it's because of like reversed engineered technologies that we had. So if you look at so Grush has stated the earliest retrieval of a UFO, right?
Mhm.
I think the earliest one that he's willing to talk about was in right before World War II. It was called the Bell, but it crashed in Italy. Italy at the time, who were kind of buddy buddy with
Yeah, it was
Nazi
Axis,
Germany.
yeah.
Yeah. They were like, yo, is this like one of your spacecraft? Or like one of your new aircraft? And Germany was like, no, but we'll take it. And Italy was like, sure. So I know during the end of World War II, it was like in the best interest of America to get that craft.
Mhm.
And if you look at IBM and all the technology that just all these companies that boomed immediately after World War
Yeah.
II, a lot of people speculate like, oh, it's probably because of this craft, like fiber optics that we get out of it, the Wi-Fi technology, Bluetooth, all this other stuff. And it's an interesting concept. And I'm not saying that like scientists on Earth can't come up with this stuff.
Right.
Because I think like Tesla is a good example of like somebody who had pretty revolutionary ideas. But what I'm saying is if I feel like the government is very hesitant because of a lot of reasons, ideology, I think it would break a lot of people's brains to know, like, oh, like a lot of Christians believe we are in God's image,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's like, if you introduce a species outside of us,
Right.
how do you explain that? And then, so like, I think, and then economically, if you completely like change how energy is produced, and it's super cheap to do so,
Right.
like a lot of people are going to be looking at like, why do we still have these coal plants? Like, why are we trying to build nuclear when there's this energy that's significantly safer?
Right.
Why am I paying X amount of dollars per kilowatt? And so I think it's going to upend a lot of stuff. But the scientists that developed this warp drive, I think it'd be interesting to see how radiation, I guess, applies to it, right? Because ultimately, if you get gravity so dense, what does it make? A black hole, right? It sucks you out of this existence that we know.
But the amount of energy to do that, right? So because you don't have the mass, so you have to, you have to beat that with energy.
Yeah.
So the amount of energy to do that is just basically so high that it's going to take something brand new, some new technology.
Like fusion's getting to the point where they're getting fusion reactors smaller,
right?
Which I think will help.
Well, I think fusion reactors will be great, and that's when you're talking about energy and everything else. I just think that it's incremental, right? Because I mean, people can, Einstein can theorize, whatever. And I never went and saw the Oppenheimer movie, but we did live down near the Trinity site, so we went out there as kids. And I mean, they knew that they should be able to split things, but they didn't know what was going to happen. CERN didn't know that if they were going to smash things fast enough together, what was going to happen.
Yeah.
They thought that it was probably safe, right? That's why they kept doing it. But there was still people that were like, well, what happens if you just create a black hole in the CERN?
We all suck into it. Yeah.
It doesn't matter. But like, scientists have been slowly progressing and proving things out that they've hypothesized or they've proved through mathematics, but they didn't experience or see. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that the first thing when you say, hey, well, how does radiation work with gravity? Right. I'm just sitting here going, well, if gravity is strong enough, it just starts pulling more things into it. Right. Which then means that you start grabbing all of the other radiation and everything else,
sucking it in,
and pulling it in and focusing it on you. It's not actually a good thing, right? Like, what's funny about the Earth is very unique, right? I'm not going to say it's the only, right? Because in an infinite universe, there is infinite amount of Earths out there, right? Whether or not they have what life or whatever, I'm not going to say. I don't know. Right. But we're not all that unique, but we're unique enough that with having a strong magnetic field,
the iron core,
right? We're protected, and life is able to grow and not just be,
blasted
mutated
away,
right? But evolution has occurred over millions and millions of years, and you can watch the different species come and go and have different mutations, and some of that can be induced with radiation as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the amount of humanoids that we have documentation of.
Yeah,
I know they just found a structure. I think it was in Indonesia or something like that, but it was like 400,000 years old, and it was a wooden structure. And because of the way the waterfall fell, no oxygen got to it.
Right.
So it was perfectly preserved. Yeah. And it was carbon dated to 400,000 years ago. And so this like completely, what is the study of humans is anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
So anthropologists are like baffled.
Yeah.
They're like, so this was probably made by another human, because our consensus is that we, Homo sapiens sapien, don't go back that far.
Right.
So they're like, it must have been another human
branch
that was smart enough to use their thumbs and make this wooden structure.
Yeah, some tool using.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because we're seeing chimpanzees kind of enter the Stone Age, which is kind of like cool.
Yeah,
as like a looking back in time. But I just hope the vastness of space at some point can be conquered. Because there's another chart, or Neil deGrasse Tyson has this globe, and he holds a ruler up, and he's like, so just for scale, if the Earth was scaled down to this, the ISS
Mm-hmm.
puts a ruler up, and he's like, it's 1/16 of an inch
Mm-hmm.
from the surface.
Yep.
He's like, the moon is the office next to me.
Right.
And it's like, you put that in perspective, is like, we always assume like the ISS is in space,
Right.
but it's just like really high orbit.
Yeah.
And it's
Well, the human brain is just not very good with numbers, right?
or scale.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's I can understand 1 to 10.
Yeah.
Right. 10,000 starts to become an issue. Like,
Yeah.
so I'll go back to
Like
banking.
visualizing
Right.
it.
So do you know what $500,000 looks like in cash? Have you ever seen $500,000 in cash?
Yeah. In law enforcement. But
Sure.
yeah.
Right. But that's what I mean.
Yes.
Very few people have, right? And the first time that you pick up $500,000,
Yeah.
because payday is coming on Friday and you've got to count it at the bank.
Sure.
And you have to go through it all. Like, it's surprisingly heavy,
Yeah.
right? But, in the movies and everything else, it's
Or just
somebody,
carrying it around.
oh, I'm going to go steal $10 million. It's like, I know what that weighs. That's not light.
Like, my dude, you're going to need at least an F-350.
Right. Or the Italian job. You're going to have to soup up those Mini Coopers. And we're just bad. The numbers start getting big, right? And you don't we know that there's about 8 billion people on the planet, right?
Yeah.
But to actually feel what that density might look like in some places, we have no clue, right? And so that's just a billion. Now you talk about, trillions, and you talk about something bigger, and our brains just kind of break down. And it's no different than when you talk about, we all think, middle class, upper class, and whatever. And most of us are debating when people are making between $30,000 and a couple $100,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is so far down on the scale, right? I think, what did I see? I think Jeff Bezos makes like $1.4 million an hour, right? It's so
that makes me mad.
It's so broken that you can't understand what that means, right? Like, the number is so large that it just doesn't make any sense. And it might not be 1.4, but
right. It's a lot.
It's a lot. It just doesn't matter, right? Because we can't fathom when Elon or Jeff Bezos has hundreds of billions of dollars, what it would take. So let's take anybody making $100,000 a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how long is it going to take them to make anything sizable, right? So after 10 years, they didn't spend any of it. Everything was paid for. That's still, only $1 million. After 100 years, their entire life, if they lived as long as $100 million, they, $10 million, right? So a person who never spends, who was able to save $100,000 a year in an entire human lifespan, can never even reach more than $10 million. And we have people that have $250 billion. And it's all of that wealth has come in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So there's something, just our brains don't work that way. So if you look at, and when you try to find scales, what you start seeing is the scales just don't make sense. But almost all of us are living in this 0 to 99, right?
Right.
And 0 to 99, for all intensive purposes, it's all roughly the same.
Yeah.
And then there's 1% that sits there, and 1/10 of 1% that sits there and is just a completely different level.
Well, and it's almost like the two are disconnected from each other.
100%. And they just start getting further and further disconnected.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that, what was it? I don't remember the numbers, but it's always interesting to see the accumulation of wealth between 99% and 1%. And you're actually just watching the transfer of wealth go from that 99% to that 1%. And so over the last 50 years, that gap in wealth, or who owns what, just continues to get further and further towards that top 1%. So it's just different. It's hard to see, because again, you and I can live in the same neighborhood. We can Kevin, he was able to buy that nicer car than me. At the end of the day, it's 20 or 30 grand, right?
Yeah,
like if we go buy a Lexus one day, it's so small, right? And the difference between a Lexus and getting a Hyundai, right?
Yeah.
It's big to us, but that's only because we live in a small scale. And when you have the ability, or when we talk about, government spending, and we're talking about trillions of dollars again, right? Our brains can't really fathom.
Yeah, I saw a really good video where it was like the national debt, national income,
Mm-hmm.
and then like there were a couple other categories, and they broke it down. They just erased zeros.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, imagine this is a household income. You have $134,000, and it broke it down into a scale that it's digestible to us.
Right.
But when you start getting, I think you're right. When you get into trillions,
like
billions is hard.
Yeah.
Like you're talking a million.
Yeah.
And you finally get to 1 billion. Right. And then they get from 1 billion to 1 trillion.
Right. So you've got 1,000 millions, right? Gets you right. And then it's 1,000.
Is it 1,000 millions?
Yeah.
I thought it was a million.
No, 1,000 millions, right? Because 100.
You're the mathematician.
Well, and
I struggle to do basic math,
but it doesn't matter. The point is, your point is exactly right. Is that you have to start breaking things down, because otherwise the numbers are so big that they make really good sound bites for politicians, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, they have meaning, and what's your focus, what's your priority, and those things matter. But you have to try to break it down to, what does that actually do for people?
Yeah.
Right. What does this mean to the rest of us? And I think that there's a lot of times where it feels almost like dealing with used car salesmen, because once your numbers are big enough, it's kind of like talking about, you just make up a unit of measure, a Googleplex or whatever, right? I just need 3 Googleplexes. And you're like, that's not so bad. It's just 3. And it's like, well, that was $3 trillion, right?
Yeah.
And we picked winners and losers for that.
Yeah.
So I think that you're exactly right. Like we talk about space, and we all think, it's not so far, it's not so bad. Like we can see the moon and we can get there pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a big difference between all of these different units of measure, and we just we're just not wired that way, right? And there's very few people that can break it down. And I like, I'll get the name wrong always, but Neil deGrasse Tyson, like he's a great one to watch. And then there's another guy that was talking about quantum, and he kind of broke it down more into something that's more digestible.
I had ChatGPT explain quantum physics to me, and I kept on having it dumb it down.
Mm-hmm.
And it finally
just said no.
Well, no, I was curious. I was like, can you explain this in a way that a 4-year-old would understand? Because Ezra's 4. And it said, okay, imagine you have 2 teddy bears.
Yeah.
And you put a teddy bear in your bedroom, and you put another teddy bear in the living room. And when you move the teddy bear in the living room, the teddy bear separated from space and time in your bedroom is also moving the same way that you're moving the teddy bear in the living room.
Or symmetrically or whatever. Yeah.
And it's like, that's quantum entanglement. The next step is, and I was like, and I always told Kaylee, I was like, I really wish, if I had I don't regret any decision that I've made in my life, because it's gotten me to this point. Right. But one thing I really wish, and I still might pursue it, is I've always had I'm terrible at math. I'm good at mathematical equations because I have time to do it.
Right.
But if you tell me to like split second do math, I'm like, it literally fries my brain. You'll start seeing smoke come out of my ears.
For me, that's spelling, right? If I can't write it down, like somebody like spell this for me, and my kids are in the backseat, so they'll just spell it. I'm like,
oh God, I'm on the spot.
I can't.
But I've always had a desire for like theoretical mathematics.
Yeah.
And just like the complex, like you take an observation and you say, okay, I'm going to find math to explain this. And that has always enthralled me.
Yeah.
So like from a very young age, I was always interested in the Hadron Collider and you know, how atoms split, how the electron can, for the longest time we thought it orbited.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, well, no, technically it just kind of appears and disappears.
Yeah.
And then reappears. And it's like, okay, well then how does that work with matter?
Mm-hmm.
Like if they're all just held on by electrons, like just being impaired with each other, like in compounds and everything else like that, what if they all just disappear at the same time?
Yeah, well,
you know,
that's the funny thing though, right? Is again, it's the limits of our. So just as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, oh, look at how big everything can be, and he talked about the inverse periodic table. Like you can continue every time we think that we found the smallest component, right? We find that we can break things down smaller, and I almost think that it's probably the same. You can continue to break things down infinitely small and infinitely large, and our brains all just kind of explode with that. Right?
Do you think that we might be living in a simulation?
I've heard that before, and I don't think so, but the being able to prove that is something completely different.
I think the thought is like math is a complex thought in itself. But if you're in a simulation, inevitably you're going to discover math. So it's like math was never created. It was just always here.
So yeah.
And there's the discovery of.
Well, so I will say this. So a long time ago, I learned that they just talk about math is just a language. It's just another language. So it already exists. Things are already here. Right. And you're just learning how to speak the language. That's all that it is. That's another way to think. Like you can break down all language. You can translate it into math if you have complex enough equations. And we can describe everything in this room with math, right? Like it's just another language, but most of us aren't very good at speaking it, myself included. Right. So I got enough math in me to understand how to solve some things. And when I first learned how to do real life proofs, right, is pretty interesting because you don't see a lot of that in school. And I got through high school. I got through high school calculus, and the proofs that we did were relatively benign, right? Like pretty simplistic. And then you go into college and you have to actually learn how to do that. And it's just one of those things where, math is there. Math is, it's
present.
It's present. It's just a way to describe things. That's all that you're doing. Right. Like they didn't like that whole thing where they had to invent the math. They had to invent how they could understand what's going on with a capsule, in low Earth orbit.
Yeah.
It's not
or Isaac Newton dropping the apple.
Right.
Or was the apple fell on him.
The physics was there, right? It's how do we understand it and how do we estimate it? Right. And that's the funny thing is a lot of math is actually just estimation to get as close as we can to understanding how something works. And that's a lot of engineering
before
as well.
Trial and error.
Right. Well, there's some of that, but it's more like pi is an infinite number, right? But we approximate a lot of things using pi, 3.14. Now, if you need some more decimal places, you can go out as far as you want, but you're still truncating,
as accurate as possible.
But you're still truncating, right? Because it's an irrational number, right? It goes on forever. So you're still.
Does that not bother you though?
No,
like the concept of infinity bothers me.
Well, it does, but I always try to break things down. I use a lot of metaphors when I talk and everything else because I try to break it down, just like you asked ChatGPT. And the show that I watched when I learned about quantum entanglement was a hot dog in two places that were quantum entangled, right? With mustard on it. And the mustard changes colors from yellow to blue. And it was happening simultaneously at both places, right? Yeah. But using that helps you understand the
extreme mathematical equation that explains all of that.
At the end of the day, it's the teddy bear moves in both places at the same time, right? Because it's entangled.
Yeah.
so yeah, using metaphors and truncating, that was one thing that I will tell you, that was one thing that I really liked about computer science was and the algorithms class in computer science. So everybody else was struggling with algorithms as I'm getting ready to take my master's and taking the other classes. So a lot of my friends were all getting bachelors, and I'm in this algorithms class with them. And basically they're like, okay, so this is how we kind of look at things from a computer science standpoint. And I had to write a paper on big O and big omega. I was getting it wrong. The teacher was basically calling everybody idiots, right? We had to prove out these concepts. And then you get to the algorithms class, and it's like, all right, so you have a very complex equation. It's n squared plus blah, 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 plus something n plus some constants and equals this. It's like, so in computer science, we just look at the largest term. That's what bounds how fast this is going to go or whatever. So he basically is just like, so this is n squared, right? And you're like, oh, this is amazing. This is simplification of math, right? Like, what is the thing that is important? What's the chunk that's important, and focus on that, right? The rest of it's noise.
But it's noise, but it's vital noise. At least to our, like with computers, I do agree with you. It's interesting, especially like when you're building simulations in computers,
right?
You set the parameters.
Correct.
Like you can make it as real to this reality as possible by carrying over that. But to my knowledge, say you want to set the parameter of a circle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pi.
Yeah.
A computer will never figure that out because it's going to be forever calculating pi.
Right. But it doesn't matter for what's the interpretation. What does it need? How many decimal places does it need? It doesn't need to know all of it. Right. So again, that's where approximations come in. That's where, like, as a mathematician, like being able to say, pi and have a symbol for it and know that it is the infinite amount. Fine. Being an engineer doesn't matter. My machine thing is only good to 1/10 of a millimeter anyways.
Yeah.
So
bringing it into
reality is like what your tolerance is, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what matters. Everything.
But don't you think the exploration of mathematics is that infinite?
It is because mathematics can be pretty neat in that regard, where it's like the language, and you can be very precise in your language. When it comes down to it, metaphor probably works. 3.14 is good enough for government work in most,
for sure.
Right? Like that's gonna be good enough for almost everything that I need it to do. Right?
Yeah.
Because what's the difference when I'm trying to find the area of this circle as compared to this square, and it's hundredths or millions off? Does it really matter? The significant factors were set by the 3.14 and the side of that on the side of that square, right? That's which one's bigger is going to be already set up front. So it's just kind of interesting to see.
I think it'd be wild if, like, could you imagine like another alien coming down and like explaining mathematics in a way that's super simple? They're like, you guys have complicated this so much.
So actually, it was Mr. Kokora, right? So it was in my trigonometry class in high school. So this was must have been 95 or 96, right? And he talked about how would you explain math to somebody who came from outer space? And that's where, instead of saying, well, it's 360 degrees, right, for a circle.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he actually said, well, this is why we have pi, because pi, and 2 pi, and we could show the formula for a circle.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could show the formula for a circle to an extraterrestrial, then they would know that you're not an idiot, basically, right? Like it would be pretty,
is true.
It'd be pretty like, because you've understood that there is something that is infinite, which is a circle, and you've then shown area and circumference and these other things.
So please don't kill me with your
with
weapons,
with your super lasers, right, or whatever. But yeah, it was a little extreme for Mr. Kokora, but we're like, how is this any different than saying 360 degrees, right? He's like, because you can translate it all, right? It's like, 2 pi or So it's just, I liked math, and I liked, some of it was really hard, right? And just going through and learning, like I said, how to do those proofs and getting things down correctly was interesting, but definitely not something that I wanted to sit in a laboratory and do the rest of my life either. So being able to take that and use computer science to go back and implement and make a radar work, make a robot arm work, like have some physical impact in the real world
that you can physically see,
that you can see and that you can watch, take cameras, do triggering events and have the camera slew and zoom. Like there's something to that, right? Actually doing those integration events where you're interacting with real hardware in the real world. It that's when it was really clicking for me that this was pretty cool, because you go through most of your school and you write a whole bunch of programs. And back then, computer science was still pretty new. So I wouldn't be surprised if, there's a lot more robotics and other things now. But I came out of school mostly writing software programs that just ran in the ether, right? Ran on the computer.
Yeah.
Didn't have any real world impact. And then you start integrating actual radar components and actual other things and actual cameras, and having to figure out how to talk their languages with their ICDs and being able to manipulate them.
I wish when I was in high school, I wish there was more technology based with mathematics, because when I was in algebra and stuff like that, and I was just sitting there doing these mathematical formulas and solving for X and everything else like that, I always found myself sitting there wondering, what the hell am I ever going to use this for? And I would ask the teacher, and they would give good answers. Like, they were good teachers, but I would always find myself sitting there saying, well, then why aren't we doing that? Like, in addition to this math class, why don't we set up an equation that we have to solve for and then have it do something at the end of the year so we can see it, even if it is just a computer simulation that say you solve for the area of a circle, right? Super simple. And then you plug it into a computer and the computer simulator, and then computer programming class, you have this equation, explain it if then statements, and then have it like bloop, 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 make pixels and make a circle. Something that I could see visually and in like stir something up in me, because again, I just found it. I like the theoretical concept of things, but when I found myself sitting there doing the mathematical equations, I was just like, this is so dumb. Like, when am I ever going to use this? And I wish I had somebody, a mentor or something, to actually pull me aside. I can't wait for like Ezra to get into mathematics and like a parabola, right? Like trajectory of anything.
Right.
I would love to sit down and be like, hey, let's set up, Alka-Seltzer tablet and some or what is it? It's
the seltzer rocket
seltzer
or
rock.
Mentos.
Yeah. Something. Let's measure the yield of energy we're going to get out of that. And then we're going to do a mathematical equation to figure out where it's going to land. And then we're going to launch it at Kevin's house.
Perfect.
But just something so he takes like whatever it is on paper and he sees it implemented. So then that might spark that curiosity and that drive.
Yeah, it'd be cool. I mean, I ended up with a minor in mathematics and economics as well. And it was just mostly because there was interesting classes that I could take during the summer when I was doing that. But seeing math and how it math being utilized in the real world and being able to use statistical models and stuff like that in economics, it was cool, right? Being able to see that all of those integrals and everything else actually could work in the real world was cool. So it'd be nice to see some more of that.
How does that feed into, because you're also a beekeeper?
Yeah.
Do you use any mathematics in your beekeeping?
No.
Or is it just trial and error?
Yeah, I'm really bad at most things, right? So I'm a jack of all trades, master of none, right? So I pick up a lot of things and I'm, more breadth first. I have a pretty wide range of things that I do. Like, came back from Kansas doing pheasant hunting today, and I've got.
Did you get anything?
Yeah, not today. Well, I shot 2 today, but my buddy and I shot one together, and then I shot another one that I couldn't find. Right, the grass was 6 feet tall or whatever.
Yeah.
But I like hunting. I'm obviously a big nerd, right, with math and computer science. So I like video games. I like so I wanted to do beekeeping for more than 15 years, and kept telling my wife, I was like, I want to get some bees. She's like, no. My mom says I'm allergic to those, right? So
that's what Christine said.
Yeah, that's what she said. It's like, my mom said I got stung once and I was allergic, and I was like, I don't know, man. Like, that seems you didn't get stung by a bee, for one. Probably it was probably a wasp, like everybody else gets stung by. But so she was a big no. But I had some friends up in Meade, and they had bees for a number of years. So I helped them for 2 or 3 years. And Christine finally said I could get some. So I get them, and I'm almost the world's worst beekeeper, right? Like I have pretty high losses of bees from year to year.
Like colony collapse.
Yeah, colony collapse. And a lot of it, I on some Facebook groups, and they're like, no, I never lose any bees, but you have to do X, Y, and Z. It's like, I like to do bees when I like to do bees, right? So
was it playing violin every day?
No, it's like, did you come and did you check the mite load, and did you do X, Y, and Z at this time? Did you take care of the hives in this way? And for me, it's mostly a hobby, right? So if the hive dies, I'll buy some more bees in the spring. I'll treat them. And then if we get honey, it's cool, right? So getting like 180 pounds of honey last year was cool. But
that's a lot of honey.
Well, it is, but the guy that I was working with before was he would average 600 or 700 pounds, right? So, but he also spent a lot more time doing with hives.
Yeah. So is colony collapse? Because I know a lot of people say like it's getting out of hand because of global warming, because of particulates in air.
I think
is it like,
so. What I think that the latest that I had kind of read and heard about was that it's no one thing, but it's a stressor. It's all the stressors on the bees, and then also how commercialized beekeeping has become, right? So most of the bees that everybody buys in the spring, all of those bees were taken out to California to pollinate all of the almond orchards and all of the different things. And farmers pay commercial beekeepers to bring out hives and to get the pollination because it spikes the yields. And then they sell those bees as they kind of move home. So they sell off all their excess bees after they've gotten paid to have them fertilize the different areas.
How are they tracking them? Or do they just pay them per truckload?
Yeah, they pay them per hive, right? So it's basically like, hey, I want to pay for 3 hives, $600.
What if they've got lazy bees? Is there such thing as a lazy bee?
Sure. I mean, there is, but at the end of the day, you could probably see, like, if your yield continues to be off year after year, you might try a different company.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Okay, so the guy brings me, a beehive with 10 bees in it. Not very cool, man. Like, and somebody else brings one with 50,000, right?
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it obviously works, and they've always figured it out. But what they do is they take a lot, and then they bring them back. But what happens is that puts a lot of bees on, these semi trucks.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that if there's disease or if there's mites or whatever, it spreads more easily between all of these bees.
Because close proximity.
Right, close proximity. And then they sell those bees off all over the U.S. as they kind of head for home. So again, it's no different than pathogens more easily transmitted because people have international travel, right?
Yeah.
So you get more disease that way. And so there's basically some mites that people are worried about as well. And those mites basically are bloodsuckers on bees. And if you have big mite loads in your hives, then it weakens them, and then they might leave because they're just like, it's not worth it. The mites stay next to all the baby bees and kind of get born with the bees.
Yeah.
And everything else. So you worry about mites and you worry about these other stuff. And then the other one is that
how do you test for mites?
So
because I'm assuming they're small.
Yeah. So what you can do is it's a sugar test, and I don't typically do it because I'm just sure I'm going to screw it up, but you take a cup full of bees, you
Yeah.
put them in a mason jar, and you basically put powdered sugar on them, and then you kind of spray them with a solution. You kind of shake it all out, and then you count the number of mites and what shook out, and then you can approximate what's your mite load, what percentage is your mite load, and but you have to like scoop up a cup of bees, and it's like
That's gonna piss off some
yeah, that's
bees
gonna
too.
piss off some bees. So like I typically just plan on treating twice a year, right?
Yeah.
I treat in the spring, and I treat in the fall, and lots of people treat lots more times than
What's the
they.
treatment like? Is it like a
So
chemical that you spray
yeah, a
on,
couple
or?
of different ones is that there's oxalic acid, which basically it's just crystals, but you vaporize it, and it then gets on the legs of the mites, and when it cools down, it recrystallizes, and then basically ends up like dropping them off or whatever. It
Does that
doesn't hurt
affect
to
the
do.
honey?
No, well, so typically you don't treat when you're collecting honey, right? Or
Okay.
when they're so you, most of the treatments happen in the spring. And then that's before you put any honey supers on.
Okay.
And then you do all your honey supers, you collect all your honey, and then you treat afterwards.
What's a honey super?
So
This is all news to me.
sure.
But I've been trying to
Right.
convince Kaylee to get into
All
it.
right.
So
So
it's like,
you typically have brood boxes on the bottom, and that's where the queen lives, and that's where they make baby bees and everything else. And they're usually a little bit taller, and they have 10 frames inside of them, and they fill those with wax that all has
the
honeycomb.
combs.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then they'll store pollen and honey, and they'll make baby bees in there and whatever. And the queen, you want her to stay down there. And if a hive is doing well, it's got the 2 brood boxes that are kind of full of bees, and they make an absolute army of bees in the springtime. And then when you're ready to collect honey, and this is supposed to be the extra, is you put a queen excluder on top of it, and then you have just a shorter, and it's called a honey super, and it can be 10 frames as well. And the reason it's shorter is because it's going to be heavy as hell, right?
Okay.
So when we pull the honey supers off of a full honey super, it's between 50 and 60 pounds. And then when you uncap it and you do all the work and you spin all of the honey out of it, then the dry weight of what's left is about 19 pounds. So
And that's the wax.
yeah, well, that's the frames, and that's the
Okay.
whatever. That's the box and the frames. So you can get, upwards of 40 pounds per honey super. So
Okay.
it's pretty heavy to work with. So you just kind of stack those up as the summer goes along, and you're checking, and depends on how much they're storing. So the hives in our backyard actually did, really well. It was probably 140 pounds of that 180 came from just those 2 hives. And really most of it came from one of those 2 hives. So everything is pretty individual as well.
Did you see the report where it's like big produced honey is the majority of like high fructose corn syrup additives, especially I think it was like was it the sugar bear or something like that came out a few years ago?
Yeah, I think that China was diluting a bunch with corn syrup and stuff. And what you do have is, so
because you lose because I like honey for the medicinal effects of it, you know what I mean? And I think a majority of people, I do enjoy how honey tastes,
right,
but I think a lot of people use it.
A lot of people
remedies.
Local honey is it can help with allergies and stuff. That's what people want it for.
Yeah.
And if you don't heat it up, it has a lot of the medicinal purposes as well. And but it is a product of what it's collecting, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a bunch of people with hummingbird feeders that are feeding sugar water, you'll get a lot of sugar water, and so it's not pure honey, but you'll get a lot of that mixed in with your honey, right? So what you want is nectar from flowers as your honey, and you want all of the local weeds, and you want all of the local pollen and everything else. And so, but there's been times where somebody has left out. Buddy of mine used to have bees a long time ago. He said that one time he had honey that tasted like Coca-Cola, right? Because somebody had spilled
left Coke out.
left Coke out or did whatever. So, and that's why all the honeys taste different and look different. It's all based on what they kind of pull up.
Well, I'll have you, Kaylee and I did, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. Kaylee and I did a experiment with garlic and honey. We ferment garlic in honey, and it's supposed to have like really good medicinal effects.
That'd be cool.
So, Kevin, we'll end with this. Do you think we're going to get back to the moon?
Yes.
When? Time frame, just ballpark of being in the field, not necessarily who you work for, but just like might be another company or something.
Right. So I'm guessing 2030, by 2030.
And then Mars within our lifetime, my lifetime.
There will be some people that die on Mars in our lifetime. Now, whether or not it turns into something more than that, I am sure that in Elon Musk's lifetime, he will have somebody that he has put on a starship and sent, and they will they will not come home, right?
Yeah.
They will die, most likely. And then the question is, do they die on the way there,
or die on the way back?
Do they die on Mars, or do
Yeah.
they die on the way back, or do they die in a liftoff on Mars and some mundane detail and they can't launch? So I do think that in our lifetime we'll see, because I think it is a big priority for Elon is to get to Mars, right?
Yeah, and he's probably got like 20 years left.
He's got at least that. Yeah,
pending any like new surgeries that come out that he can only pay for, you know.
Right.
Or he takes his you watch Futurama, right?
Yeah.
Remember like the heads? Yeah. Well, he's probably just take his head off and put it.
No, I definitely think that in our lifetime, some people will go out to Mars, and it will probably the first sets are it's not going to be good, right? Like, and it's no different than when we first started going to the moon, right?
Yeah.
Bad stuff happens. Rocket science is actually hard, right? Like doing all of these, working with all these different groups that are trying to, make small launch providers that basically they just have problems and they blow up, and it takes them years to figure it out.
And we've only been doing it for 60 years.
Yeah.
70 years.
Right.
Well, I guess if you talk the V2 rocket,
sure.
The Germans. So like probably 19...
Not the 40s still.
30s, 40s, yeah.
Yes, well, yeah, it was still the 40s, yeah. Because I think that they didn't have it to start with. So it was in the 40s that they started using it, and it was still kind of crappy.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're still talking about less than 100 years.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I appreciate the time, man.
Yeah.
I appreciate you joining us. And this is where I give my little spiel for you listeners. Like, follow, share, subscribe. And don't forget to go to the snepodcast.com and sign up for the first to know. You could have submitted a question that I could be asking Kevin right now. Kevin, are there any questions I didn't ask you that I should have?
No.
I wouldn't know because there was only one and I've already asked it. Your name will never be mentioned when I ask questions. It just kind of helps me figure out what my listeners are interested in listening to. So again, snepodcast.com. Kevin, thank you so much, man.
All right. Thanks.